just been probably fairly mainstream pop songs. But because Robert Smith is not a member of a boy band, you know, they weren't. I think weirdly the songs he does best, and it's perhaps not what he's known best for, is that he does actually write really good love songs. It's just that when you're listening to them, it's not always immediately apparent that it is a love song, because he doesn't deal in the cliched.
They were unclassifiable, and at their best they always are, and they kind of leave in their wake ideas that they might be post-punk, or they might be goth, or they might be, you know, power pop, or they might be whatever, but often I think it's because they're just writhing about in their own particular area. And what I ended up liking about them the most was that they always confounded expectations based on his sheer sort of perversity. And almost if it was about to be something that could be classified, he would turn his back on it. So if he felt they were becoming too much a pop group, then he'd go into the soundscape. And if he felt that they were being too much, you know, art pop, then he'd turn his back on that. And that was, in the end, one of the things that I really started to enjoy about him, his utter perversity.
A lot of the tracks are not time-specific. They're not... Because they never followed a fashion, like they never tried to make a punk rock track or a ska track or a two-tone track or whatever, or new romantic track. They never got bogged down in going for that particular sound or that particular style or that particular structure or that particular vocal affectation. They really ploughed their own furrow, and because of that, okay, some of the recording techniques maybe sound a little bit dated now, but in general, a lot of that music, if it came out on the radio now for the first time, you'd never heard it before, it would be very difficult to say, when was this first recorded? You know, is this a new band or is this an old band? And you know, if it's an old band, is that a 70s track, an 80s track, a 90s track?
The Cure have dabbled in all sorts of genres in their time, but I mean, the key to them is that they did essentially invent goth. Now, that obviously means Robert Smith is responsible for thousands upon thousands of really dreadful bands, but should never be held against the Cure, because although, you know, they had all the staples of goth in their element, you know, they wore black, they had big hair, they wrote miserable songs. You know, they just did it because they were the first, they did it in, you know, a really fresh and exciting way. And when the Cure were goth, it never seemed to be quite such a sad thing as when Fields of Nephilim were goth. And so for a lot of people, they're always going to be associated with that movement. But the key to the Cure was that they were never just tied to that, and when goth died, the Cure didn't die with it. You know, they just reinvented themselves again and kept going.
In 1986, The Cure released a collection of their singles, Staring at the Sea. The album went gold in the US and consolidated the transatlantic success of Head on the Door. The band followed up in 1987 with Kiss Me, Kiss Me, Kiss Me, a double album often considered to be a mix of their best styles. The album spawned a raft of hit singles, both at home and in the US.
Kiss Me, Kiss Me, Kiss Me. I think Catch is one of my favourite Cure songs of all time. I think he's a great lyricist, and there's that wonderful line. Even though it felt soft at the time, I always used to wake up sore, and I just think that's absolutely brilliant.
Lol Tolhurst departed acrimoniously from The Cure in 1988. Tolhurst filed and eventually lost a lawsuit against the band, claiming that his contribution merited greater financial reward than his contract provided for. The band replaced Tolhurst with Roger O'Donnell and released Disintegration in 1989. The album was a huge critical and commercial success, entering the UK chart at number 2 and the US Billboard at number 14. The band followed up the success of the album with a stadium tour on both sides of the Atlantic.
The Cure peaked commercially and probably artistically on, you know, Disintegration, which was at the very end of the 80s for me. Since then, you know, the Cure haven't been cool. They weren't particularly cool before then, but they certainly have been nowhere near cool since then, until now, ironically. Loads of bands have decided they're hip. But they were always there, and the thing about the Cure is that the work they did in the 80s has basically insured them against needing to be cool, because you wouldn't read about The Cure in the 90s in you know, trendy magazines. You wouldn't see them on the telly, but every time they did a gig, it would always be a really, really big gig, and it would always sell out because they, you know, they've just got that army of devotees.
They're always slightly marginalised, and they always have a minority constituency. But the minority constituency can still be massive. You know, of course, it's just a flake of the record-buying public, a tiny flake of it. But globally, as long as they're still in there punching, they're making a fantastic living.
There's always going to be people that are going to like us because of what we look like or because we're a group. But at the same time, I think we have a high percentage of people who do listen to what we do and are very critical of what we do as well. We've always had a very critical audience, which from time to time can get annoying, but it's generally a good thing to have.
In 1992, The Cure released the hugely successful Wish. The album went to #1 in the UK and #2 in the US and included the multi-platinum single Friday I'm in Love. However, subsequent lineup changes, the ongoing legal dispute with Tolhurst and the emergence of Britpop sidelined The Cure for the rest of the early 90s.
It's ironic, really, that in many ways Robert Smith wrote the template for Britpop, in that it was, you know, pop songs done in a quirky alternative way, which I'm sure a lot of those Britpop bands picked up on subconsciously, if nothing else. But that was the movement that really sort of finished The Cure off as a hip band for the media. But it didn't kill them. It killed lots of other bands.
In '96, a lot of bands who were experimental in nature or were interesting had a problem because of Britpop in this country, you know, in the UK especially. But I think it spread wide apart. There was that sort of nostalgic need to go back to the '60s, normal shapes of pop songs, you know, normal symbols of the swinging '60s, Union Jacks and the Beatles, and something like The Cure. They were one of the groups that definitely would have suffered in that period because they were by nature experimental. And you did get the feeling that groups like The Cure were slipping off the planet almost because it was a very tricky time for forward-thinking people, and Robert Smith has always been a forward-thinking person, wouldn't have wanted to join in with that grey. You know, Britpop is everything he does not believe in because it was so grey and conservative, where he's a flamboyant personality that's into dreams and exuberance. And I think that, you know, that was one of those moments. There's been many of them where you think The Cure have gone. I mean, I think, for me, The Cure have split up hundreds of times. He's just never really told us officially, and it's never been the case ultimately because it's Robert Smith, and he's not split up per se, although occasionally he has. So you did get the feeling, the idea of the brand name The Cure, it was all over, and you could not possibly see how it could happen again.
In 1995, with Williams and Thompson replaced by Perry Belmonte and Jason Cooper, The Cure began recording their 10th full studio album. Wild Mood Swings was released in 1996, and a world tour followed.
The brief was really to move the band on from where they'd been, because they'd been one of the biggest bands of the 80s and the early 90s. And he felt that... my impression was that he felt slightly stagnated in what they'd been, and now was a whole new evolution of the band because two of the major members of the band had left. When I started, there was no drummer, so we gradually put the band together over the first recording sessions, and that was quite amusing. Where what we did was we put the basics of the tracks together. Obviously myself recording and running around, and then Robert, Perry and Simon playing along to a click track. And then the drummers would come along and they would play just to that, not with the rest of the band. So I would have to put this relationship together between myself and the drummer as a musician and the rest of the band. So that was an interesting position to be in, and Robert would be kind of in this huge house with the rest of the band, sort of popping their head around the corner and seeing how things were going. So it was very different beginnings to a record. The title in itself sort of encompasses basically the feel of the whole record, because there are lots of different types of songs on it. From Want, which is, I think, the lead opening song, which is a full-on kind of wild rock track, to something like Bear, which is